Before advancing to what I think is the most fun part about rendering, lighting the scene, we need to create a well-crafted composition. Composition is often the difference between a render that feels considered and one that feels random. You could have the best materials and lighting, but without a strong composition, your render will still fall flat. Before we speak on camera settings, let's be clear what composition actually is. Composition is how elements are arranged within a frame. Composition is not a single setting you turn on. It is the result of many small choices working together, including camera position, angle, distance, framing, and what you choose to include or exclude from the shot. At its simplest, composition answers one question. What do you want your viewers to notice first? For product shots, the most straightforward composition is placing the subject directly in the center of the frame. This creates clarity and stability. It tells the viewer exactly where to look, and it is often the right choice when the goal is pure communication. If you want a more dynamic feeling, rotating the subject on a diagonal can introduce energy, movement, or a sense of power. Another common approach is the rule of thirds, where key elements are placed along the thirds of the frame rather than dead center. This tends to feel more natural and balanced, especially when the product has a strong direction or when multiple elements share the same frame. Composition is not only about where the product sits, it's also about the relationship between elements in a frame. One of the simplest relationships is symmetry, where elements are intentionally balanced across an axis to create stability and clarity. Negative space, background shapes, shadows, and supporting objects all influence how the main subject is perceived. In a symmetrical composition, these elements are often mirrored to reinforce that balance. Pattern compositions take this idea further by repeating those relationships across the frame. Instead of a single balanced object, the viewer first reads rhythm and repetition, and then discovers the hero element within that structure. So far, we've been talking about composition in terms of placement: centered, diagonal, pattern, etc. Those are all two-dimensional decisions. You are deciding where elements fit within the frame. But composition is not only about placement. You can keep a subject in the same exact spot, the camera in the same location, and the image still feels different. Why? Because composition is also about perspective, and perspective is strongly influenced by a camera's position and the lens you choose. Let's break that down. In photography and in KeyShot, there are two ways to make the subject fill more of the frame. The first is to physically move the camera closer. This is called dollying. When you move the camera, you change perspective. Objects in the foreground grow faster in size than objects in the background. The space feels deeper. You are not just making the space larger, you are changing the spatial relationship between objects in the scene. When you dolly the camera toward an isolated subject, you are mainly changing scale, not perspective. The second way to make a subject fill more of the frame is to leave the camera where it is and change the focal length. This is typically done by zooming the lens. When you increase the focal length, the field of view becomes narrower. The subject itself fills more of the frame, but the perspective itself does not change because the camera has not moved. What changes instead is compression. Longer focal lengths compress spatial relationships. Depth is reduced. The image feels flatter. Short focal lengths do the opposite. They widen the field of view and exaggerate depth. Space feels stretched. Objects near the edges may appear distorted. Let's look at a practical example. In each of these renders, the product is framed in the same position within the composition. The image on the far left was captured at 24 millimeters, a wide focal length. Notice the distortion. The vertical edges of the suitcase are no longer parallel. The form feels stretched. Wide lenses are excellent for interiors or architectural spaces where you want to emphasize depth, but they could introduce distortion in product work. As we move to the right, the focal length increases. The objects gradually appear flatter. Edges become more parallel. The sense of depth decreases. Nothing about the subject's placement changed. The framing is consistent. Only the lens changed. Same subject, same framing, different lens, different feeling. Now that we have a better understanding of composition, let's bring these ideas into KeyShot Studio. So far, we've been rotating around our scene, changing its composition while evaluating different parts of our model. But let's establish a composition formally. To do this, we need to click into the camera tab and then click on this icon right here to add a camera. We can now move around like before, but we now have the ability to save the camera's position by clicking on the floppy disk icon right here. If we move the camera position, click off of the camera, and then back into it, we can see that our view jumps back to where it was when we saved the camera. Awesome, we can now start adjusting our camera and repositioning it. But first, let's start by changing the aspect ratio of our rendering. In the image dropdown, if the lock aspect option is unchecked, you could always drag parts of the interface to adjust the aspect ratio of the real-time view, but we want to be more specific. Within the same image tab, there's a dropdown named Resolution Presets. Here's where you could specify if you want your aspect ratio to be more wide than it is tall, like a landscape photo, or if you'd like a vertical format similar to a portrait. You could also specify image sizes measured in pixels. Additionally, there are also common aspect ratios listed at the bottom, and in our case, we want to select the 1:1 ratio to ensure we have a square render. Our aspect ratio is now set, but the image size needs to be adjusted. We can simply go back to the image tab once more and uncheck Lock Resolution, which will give us the ability to reposition our interface, resizing our real-time view in the process. Next, I want to improve our current composition. I want our headphones to float, giving them a weightless yet powerful visual. One might think we need to go into the Scene tab, select our parts, and then move the object up in the air to make it float, right? Not necessarily. You could, but there's an easier way. Instead, we want to select the Environment tab, which will be covered more when we light our scene, and to scroll down to the ground settings, where we can turn off the ground shadows. Boom, our product is now floating. Next, click into the Camera tab, left click to rotate under the object, press the middle mouse wheel to pan the camera, and resave the camera. KeyShot Studio has a very useful grid function, which can aid in composing your shot. Let's select the quarters option to help center the product and then save the changes. As we just learned, a camera's lens settings can have a massive impact on the composition. Here is where you could set the lens focal length. Don't worry if focal length still feels abstract. The easiest way to understand it is to adjust the value and observe what happens. As we previously discussed, lower focal lengths create a wider field of view and exaggerate perspective. Higher focal lengths narrow the field of view, compress perspective, and make the headphones appear flatter and more natural. Let's type in a value of 120 and then make some additional rotation and position adjustments to our camera. Don't forget to go back into the grid settings in order to turn the grid off.